The Hurrians had a similar story where their old gods were led by one named Kumarbi, and he was overthrown by the storm god whose name was Teshub, who became the king of the gods. And after the 1940s, scholars looking at this realized, oh, this is the same story the Greeks and the Romans told about the Titans and, Zeus, Jupiter. But you can even take it back farther, and you find that in Mesopotamia, there's a similar story with Anu, the sky god, being replaced by Enlil, who in turn is replaced by Marduk. In Canaan, you had a sky god, Shemaim, who is barely mentioned in the Canaanite texts, but he's replaced by El, who in turn is replaced by Baal, the storm god. It's the same pattern over and over. Even in the Norse pantheon, you've got Odin, the old king, who's replaced by Thor, the storm god.
Aloha and welcome to another show, guys. I truly am happy to see you guys here today. I usually try to bring you guys something new every week, but today I'm re-sharing a powerful episode that's definitely worth another listen. Just a quick heads up before we dive in. Some of you know already that I've had a video once taken down, and I have been flagged or given warnings about some other videos on YouTube. So if there's anything that happens to this channel, or if I suddenly disappear from your feed, I want to make sure that we can stay connected. And that's why it's important that you guys sign up for free on my Patreon account. That's where, from this point on, I guess I will share any updates and contents and things that I can't always post publicly on YouTube. Until my new website is finished. Yes, it's not done yet. Don't ask. But for now, that's going to be the best place to find me, is on my Patreon account. And I want to take a moment to thank my amazing supporters. To each and every one of you who's contributed through Buy Me a Coffee and who has supported me through my Patreon, thank you so much. I see you. I appreciate you more than I can say. Steph, you're amazing. I just can't believe everything that you've done. Thank you so much for your contributions to me and being such a support. I appreciate you, Steph, so much. Jenny, Carla, Andrew, Kevin, and David Z, or David Z. I don't know. I feel like I have to say David Z. Thank you so much, guys, for supporting me. I really appreciate you guys more than you could ever know. I also send you guys a personal email thanking you, so I hope you guys get that as well, because I don't know if you do get my emails, so I hope you do. And you guys are the reason why this show is still alive and growing. And of course, thank you to everyone who tunes in, who shares, who comments, and supports in their own way. I might not respond to every message on YouTube, especially the crazy ones that I get. Sometimes I do respond to them, but I see you. I appreciate you. Now, let's talk about today's guest, Derek Gilbert. He's an author, a broadcaster who dives deep into the connections between ancient mythology, biblical prophecy, and spiritual warfare. You've probably seen him on Skywatch TV, A View from the Bunker, Unraveling Revelation, PID Radio, and Gilbert House Fellowship. This conversation is loaded with insight and relevance, so I'm excited to bring it back around. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button, follow the show, and tap that bell so you're always updated when new episodes drops. You can also follow me on Patreon. There's no ads, no censorship, and sometimes I drop bonus episodes. It's all free, but donations are always appreciated. Now, I hope you enjoy the show.
Hi, Derek. Welcome to the show. You are a renowned author, a broadcaster known for your deep dives of ancient myths, biblical prophecy, modern culture. And today we're especially excited to talk to you about your fascinating work on your second coming of Saturn. But before we dive in, you have several platforms, including A View from the Bunker, Skywatch TV, PID Radio, Gilbert House Fellowship, and something I found out today was Unraveling Revelation. You also have an app with all of your podcasts on there, which is how I found the Unraveling Revelation, called GHTV or Gilbert House TV.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sharon and I have been doing this podcasting since 2005. We started podcasting way back when Apple was still begging people to submit RSS feeds. So I think there's like 6 months after the code to syndicate podcasts had been developed by, was it Adam Curry and Dave Weiner? And so we were early on in the game, but I had a broadcasting background, so we were just trying to look for tools that we had where we could try to market a series of novels that we were working on back then. And it turned out that we started podcasting not to market our novels. We started writing so we'd get into the podcasting. And that led to interviews with people like the late Dr. Michael Heiser, L.A. Marzullia, who I know has been a recent guest on your program, the late Dr. Tom Horn, and others. And that led to where we are now. I mean, just essentially one thing led to another. It became a passion, this investigation, this research, putting the pieces together. And so podcasting became a means of learning from these other folks, but then diving into other academic works, scholarship. We found a number of good sources online where peer-reviewed scholars or scholars will upload their peer-reviewed research for others to access and benefit from. So, a lot of what we do may sound fringe. In fact, I know if you go to a certain some of the AI tools out there and ask, who is Derek Gilbert? Who is Sharon K. Gilbert? We are fringe pseudo-archaeologist, pseudo-historian whose beliefs... All right, fine, we'll wear that as a badge of honor because all of the information that we're drawing from to come up with these conclusions that may sound fringe to people who've not been taught this stuff is based on sound academic research by people who have done the digging in the field, people, epigraphers who've translated the original text and then published it and had their work cross-checked and cross-referenced by others. So our conclusions may be wrong, but at least it's not based on speculation. And it's what we were designed to do.
Yeah, I don't even know how you have time to do everything that you do. You do so much.
Well, no kids at home. No kids at home. That helps.
That does
help.
Two
dogs.
But 2 dogs, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like children, though. That's for sure. Is that how you met your wife? Through broadcasting? Because she also has a voice like broadcasting, like you.
She does, but she was actually a professional singer.
Oh, I didn't know that.
She spent more than 20 years making a living with her voice, both fronting bands. I mean, she was a rock and roll singer, but she also trained to sing opera. She sang jingles at a studio in Indianapolis for some time, singing with the likes of Sandy Patty and Steve Green. So she's got a trained voice in that regard. I just got into broadcasting when I was in college, started out at a campus radio station, got involved in broadcasting, which I am willing to admit now was because of basically being insecure and finding out that there was a certain segment of the population, young ladies, who are impressed by a guy who can talk into a microphone. At the time that was, hey, if I can do this and get paid for it, then why bother with something like, going to law school or getting a business degree? I did get a degree in econ, but I wound up going into broadcasting, was in that for a number of years. And that really, looking back on it, was training for what we're doing now. But no, we did not meet this way. At the time we met, I was selling steel pipe specifically for a company in St. Louis. And Sharon was an adult student at Indiana University. So we were living a couple hundred miles apart. And back in 1997, She had been divorced for some time. My marriage was falling apart, and so I was a Mr. Mom with a 6-year-old daughter at the time, 7-year-old daughter at the time, and thought, okay, I'd like to meet somebody else. I really don't fancy spending the rest of my life as a single dad, but I'm not. I tried the bar scene when I was younger in my 20s, and that didn't work out so well. So I thought, all right, I know that there are personal ads in these newspapers and whatnot. St. Louis has got an alternative paper called the Riverfront Times, but their personal ads are, at least back in the 90s, they were really scary. So then I heard about this thing online called Match.com. And, again, this is 1997, so this is when only 20% of America was even getting online. So think about that. 80% of America was not online at the time. I went online, and within hours, I found this beautiful woman in Indiana whose interests were really intriguing. And so I sent her an email. She sent me an email. At the time, it was, through usernames, and then eventually we exchanged phone numbers. This was when you still had to pay for long-distance calls. And so one thing led to another. We met. I think we first communicated in July of that year. We met in September. We married in January of 1998. So here we are 26 years later. And, it's clear that the Lord had a plan in this, because I can't imagine anyone else in this world who gets me the way she gets me, and vice versa. So, and just to show you the hand of God in this, there's a little survey when you sign up for these sites. What kind of woman are you looking for? What kind of man are you looking for? How far are you willing to travel? And I checked the box that said 200 miles. And later we looked, and from my house to hers in Bloomington, Indiana, was like 195 miles. So my friends thought I was crazy. There are 2.5 million people living within 50 miles of you. What's your hey, look, if she's worth spending the rest of my life with, I'll go 200 miles. And lo and behold, it's a good thing I checked that box.
Yeah, that's amazing. I never heard that story before. That's so cool. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, there are some people who will say, have you actually seen a miracle? It's like, well, sometimes we have to maybe expand our definition of what miracle is. It's not always a bolt from heaven, consuming a pagan sacrifice with fire. Sometimes it's something a little more mundane, like, why did I make that decision? Things turned out radically differently than they might have if I had made a different decision. Why was I moved to make... Okay, I'll call that a miracle.
Yeah. God certainly did answer your prayers, because she definitely was.
Amen.
Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, thank you for that story. That's beautiful.
So there is hope that even if we don't always get it right the first time, because many of us, when we get involved in our first relationships, are a little too young to have the wisdom needed to choose wisely, the Lord can help you the second time around, or even the third time around. And
that's true.
So that is true for both Sharon and me, and we are just happy as can be. And the Lord, again, has placed us exactly where He wants us for what He wants us to be doing. My background, broadcasting, and just a love of trying to figure out puzzles and mysteries. Sharon's background, both in terms of performance, not that what we do involves performing, but just trying to communicate ideas, how to teach and present ideas in a way that will be received well. But also, when she decided to give up a career in music, she decided she didn't want to be a diva. She went back to school and got a degree in molecular biology. So,
wow,
that training has come in handy as well. Yeah, she's got both halves of her brain going on. She is the smartest person I know. So,
yeah,
and she married me anyway.
You both are very fortunate to have each other. That's amazing. I love that story.
Indeed,
you guys make great companions. When you talk on the radio, it's amazing. You guys both just click really well, so it comes out really good.
Yeah, I've got the broadcast experience, but I am the first one to admit that the two of us together, as whether it's hosting a program, must be Amazon. Yeah. That is Grace, the rescue dog, who is alerting. For whatever reason, Amazon, UPS, FedEx, and U.S. Postal Service, those are all her mortal enemies. So when she comes out here to the barn with me to work, and generally she will just lie quietly and she'll look out the door. We got a storm door so she can see out. But boy, when a delivery arrives, we know it. Anyway, cool. I'm the first one to admit that Sharon and I together are much more effective at communicating than just me by myself. So
that is true.
Even though I host the daily news update for Skywatch TV, when Sharon and I are together on Unraveling Revelation or our podcast, our Bible study, it's much, much better. There's a dynamic there that, having been in radio, I was in radio for more than a decade before getting out, when I realized it was not a good way to try to raise a family. I saw a lot of morning show teams where program directors would partner together, a couple of guys or a guy and a gal, and they'd have to work really hard to get a good chemistry. And we had it just from the very first podcast. So, and since we've been doing this now for 20 years going on, we've had a little time to, practice.
Yeah. I found you both that way. I think it was the Gilbert house. That's how I found you a long time ago. I think it was 2015 or 16, something like that. I heard you both
not long
talking.
after we started it then.
Yeah. Yep. I've been following you folks since. So this is great. And I love your book, your latest or your newer book, The Second Coming of Saturn. I'm truly impressed by the depths of your research. It's incredible. It's clear that you put a lot of effort into exploring these complex themes. In your book, you mentioned that Saturn has been known by many names over the last 6,000 years, each reflecting different cultures and understanding. Could you elaborate on some of these names and explain how Saturn's identities has shifted and evolved over various civilizations?
Sure. Saturn is not just the name of a planet. It, of course, was the name of a deity in the Roman pantheon. He was the father of Jupiter, who became king of the pantheon by overthrowing Saturn and throwing Saturn and his that generation, the older generation of gods called Titans, into Tartarus and locking them up. This is the same myth told by the Greeks about their king of the gods, Zeus, the storm god, who overthrew Kronos and threw Kronos and the Titans into the underworld. Interestingly, this has only been known now since the 1940s, when texts from the Hurrian culture, who occupied what is roughly the Kurdish regions of northern Iraq, northern Syria, northwest Iran today, but also the Hurrians were found down into what became Canaan and then Israel. In the Bible, they're called Horites. So they're a well-known culture to archaeologists and historians, but not so much to us today. The Hurrians had a similar story where their old gods were led by one named Kumarbi, and he was overthrown by the storm god whose name was Teshub, who became the king of the gods. And after the 1940s, scholars looking at this realized, oh, this is the same story the Greeks and the Romans told about the Titans and, Zeus, Jupiter. But you can even take it back farther, and you find that in Mesopotamia, there's a similar story with Anu, the sky god, being replaced by Enlil, who in turn is replaced by Marduk. In Canaan, you had a sky god, Shemaim, who is barely mentioned in the Canaanite texts, but he's replaced by El, who in turn is replaced by Baal, the storm god. It's the same pattern over and over. Even in the Norse pantheon, you've got Odin, the old king, who's replaced by Thor, the storm god. The Indian pantheon, the ancient Hindu, well, not Hindu, but it's like the Vedic tradition, where you've got a storm god named Indra, who becomes king of the pantheon. The Slavs, with their storm god, Perun. It's the same story over and over in that part of the world, and it all seems to derive from Mesopotamia. But there's even more recent research suggesting that it comes from the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, which makes sense if you believe the biblical history is true and Noah's Ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat, which is right in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So in tracing this character, and really this came out of the study of Genesis chapter 6, and the book of First Enoch, which expands on the story in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, which is, tells how the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were fair and took wives of any they chose. And from these unions, when the sons of God went into the daughters of man, which is a euphemism for physical relations, giants were born, the Nephilim. This story expanded on in the book of First Enoch, the first 36 chapters, called the Book of the Watchers. They were led by one who is called Chief of the Watchers, called Shemiyaza, which is a Hebrew word that roughly translates as the name, Hashem. The name has seen. In other words, God saw what he did and didn't like it. Well, according to First Enoch, he gets confined to the netherworld, along with his colleagues. In the New Testament, both Peter and Jude make reference to angels who'd sinned, who were in chains in gloomy darkness. In fact, in 2 Peter 2, verse 4, he's very specific and says that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but thrust them down to Tartarus. Our English Bibles say hell, but the word in Greek is not Hades, it's Tartarosis, literally meaning thrust down to Tartarus. Now, in Greek religion, this was a separate level of the netherworld reserved for supernatural threats to the divine order of things. This is where the gods were confined. This is not where the dead went. This is where you would put the giants. This is where you put the titans. This is where you put the Typhon, the chaos monster. This is where the ones that really needed to be under maximum security were kept. And Peter used that word deliberately, under the influence of the Holy Spirit. So you look at that and it's like, okay, now the Greeks say that their old gods, the Titans, were sent to Tartarus. Is there any chance that these are the same group? And I would suggest that yes, it is in fact the same group. The Mesopotamians had stories of a similar group called the Apkallu. And in one of their myths called the Epic of Era, their chief god Marduk tells of how he got angry and he sent a massive flood, after which he told the Apkallu to go into the Apsu, or the abyss, and never return. So it's what we get in the pagan stories. Long story short, the pagan mythologies, which is really just the pagan religions of the ancient world, are the fake news versions of what's in the Bible. So I was really curious if we know that there is this creature called Shemiyaza, who God considered so dangerous that he and his colleagues were confined in chains in gloomy darkness in the bottomless pit, Tartarus, according to Peter, while Satan is still wandering the earth. Why don't we see anything more about this entity in history? Why did he just disappear? And so I started pulling on those threads of research, and I think the evidence shows that this entity, Saturn, Kronos, known to the Canaanites as El, to the Philistines and the Amorites as Dagon, to the Akkadians and Babylonians as Enlil, to the Hurrians and the Hittites as Kumarbi. The Assyrians called him Ashur. The Hebrews called him Molech. I think this is the same entity that we're seeing in First Enoch as Shemiyaza. And when you start digging into the Old Testament, you see that there are references in the Old Testament that I think point to this entity. So essentially, I was just trying to untangle, where did this character go? If he was so dangerous that God had to throw him in chains in the bottomless pit, why is there nothing more about him in history? And I think there is. It's just been sort of translated out over the centuries. Even though the pagans around ancient Israel continued to worship him. I mean, the most popular annual festival in the Roman calendar was the Saturnalia. But the Greeks had a similar festival called the Chronia, and apparently the ancient Hurrians, whose version of this entity, Kumarbi, is the oldest one attested in writing, going back to about 3000 BC. Maybe there's more going on here, and we can learn something about this entity and what his motives are and what he hopes to achieve. Because I think then when we look at Revelation 9 and the opening of the bottomless pit, this would be the leading candidate for the identity of the king over those in the bottomless pit, Abaddon or Apollyon, the destroyer.
Wow. Yeah, I was going to ask you about some of these rituals. Your analysis cover how the worship of Saturn or Saturn-like figures has shaped rites and rituals and society structures across various civilizations from ancient times to medieval times, and even our modern day practices. Could you elaborate on specific rituals and symbols from history that you believe are remnants of this ancient worship?
Yeah, the spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood, the spirits of the Nephilim, later called Rephaim in the Bible. And it's clear in the references in the Old Testament that the Rephaim were believed to occupy a place in the midst of Sheol. That's in Ezekiel chapter 32. But they're also mentioned elsewhere in Proverbs chapter 2, as being in Sheol. It's usually, though, the reference to the Rephaim, because translators, until the last 40 years or so, when it became accepted that there was a cult of the dead that had surrounded ancient Israel, and that the veneration of the Rephaim was a regular feature of the religion of the Amorites, the Canaanites, who lived around the ancient Israelites. The English translations of our Bible generally render the word Rephaim, except in places where it's clear that it was a proper name, like the Rephaim tribes defeated by the kings from the east. Kedorlaomer, the king of Elam, in Genesis chapter 14, they defeated the Rephaim tribes in the Transjordan. That's the area east of the Jordan River. But elsewhere, in Isaiah 14, in Isaiah 26, a couple of places in the Proverbs, in Job, the word Rephaim, rather than being translated as spirits of the giants, is rendered the dead or the shades or the departed, as though they're referring to just the run-of-the-mill human dead. And that's not how the Hebrew prophets understood it. And it's clear when you read in context. In fact, it's clear when you read the Septuagint translation of the Bible, which was translated by Jewish religious scholars around the year 200 BC, so a couple hundred years before the birth of Jesus, working with texts of what we, Gentiles would call the Old Testament, or what we Christians would call the Old Testament. They understood in many of these places that reference to the Rephaim was referring to the giants, and we'll translate those verses as such. So when we do our Bible study now, we make a point of looking at the Septuagint when we're going through the Old Testament, just to compare how things are different. After the 2nd century AD, Jewish religious scholars tried to de-emphasize in the Hebrew Bible references to other spirit beings, because those annoying Christians kept pointing to things like the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, saying, we know who that is. That was Jesus of Nazareth. And that's not acceptable in Jewish religious thought. But there's some good scholarly work showing that until the time of the rise of Christianity, it was accepted in Jewish religious thought that there was a second power in heaven. The angel of the Lord, Yahweh, but not Yahweh. I mean, the physical manifestation of Yahweh. It's Yahweh, but it's not Yahweh, okay? He's like the vice regent. It's a multidimensional thing that we humans can't really get our heads around very well, but that was part of Jewish religious thought until Christians came around and said, we know who that second power in heaven is. And so there are a number of subtle changes in the Old Testament, nothing doctrinal, but just enough there so that you kind of de-emphasize it. So the veneration of the Rephaim was central to the religion really in all of Mesopotamia. And you can trace this to the Amorites. In our book Veneration, Sharon and I did a deep dive into this and found that, according to scholars, the earliest references to this a monthly ritual where people would summon their dead ancestors by name to a meal, a ritual meal. It was a necromancy ritual, and then you would feed the ancestors using teraphim. Those are those little household gods or household idols that Jacob stole from his father-in-law, Laban. Those were really a big deal. You had to maintain contact with the spirits of the ancestors. So every month on the 30th of the month, which was the night when there was no moon, The night before the new moon, when you start a new month, 30-day cycle on a lunar calendar. The night of no moon, when everything is dark, the veil between the worlds was thinnest, apparently. And so families would sit down to this ritual meal, and they would call the ancestors by name. I summon thee, oh, grandma. I summon thee, oh, great uncle Fred, or whatever. And then they would feed them. They'd take the little statues. They'd smear a piece of bread on the face. Okay, that's how we're feeding great uncle Fred. And then they would pour out a drink offering, a libation. And in some Amorite communities, in fact, I read one scholar who wrote that in all of the Amorite communities that have been excavated in Syria and Iraq, Canaan, they have yet to find a communal cemetery because people were buried underneath the floors of the houses. I guess they didn't want dead grandpa to have to travel more than about 6 feet to get to the ritual meal. But they found that in these burials, there were often libation tubes. They would put a tube to the body, so when you did the monthly ritual, you would pour out the drink offering, and it would go right to the corpse. That's how they sustained their ancestors in the afterlife. And so it was believed by people in that day and age, the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that unless you had heirs, family members, descendants, who would perform these rituals, you would starve in the afterlife. You would have to eat clay and drink rotten, dirty water, eat rotten straw. You would not be sustained in the afterlife. You would fade away to nothing. And this, I think, explains why Abraham and Sarah were so distressed about not having a son of their own. But this was so important in Amorite culture that scholars have found what amounts to wills, where people would will the ownership of the family gods to a favored child. Usually it would go to the eldest son, who would take over the ritual. He would inherit the household gods and inherit contact with the household gods, the ancestors, and have to keep up the communication with them, add another generation to the list of names that you got to memorize and summon every month. But this tradition continued. I mean, you remember the story of David trying to hide from the guards that King Saul sent to get him, and his wife Michal put one of the teraphim in the bed so that the guards would think they were, David was here, he's in the bed, great, we've got the drop on him, let's arrest him. Oh, it's just a household idol. Why did David even have one of those things? Because the culture still believed in this, and still there's a reference to David's son Absalom in 2 Samuel, was it 1 Samuel? Might be 1 Samuel 18:18. Anyway, I'd have to look it up again. But Samuel erected a pillar for himself in the valley of the, what do I call it, the Valley of the Kings? Anyway, he erected this pillar for himself to keep his name, because he had no son to keep his name in remembrance. Where this is a reference again to that practice that was done by the Amorites. He didn't have any kids to say his name and keep him alive in the afterlife. Even though he was the son of David, who had gotten a lot of revelation directly from God the Father, the culture was that pervasive. This continued into the Christian era. Where when Constantine the Great, who legalized Christianity in the early 4th century, 313 AD, the earliest Christian churches built in Rome, including St. Peter's Basilica, which is on the grounds of the Vatican now, were built in the middle of cemeteries because even 300 years after the resurrection, Christians were still having these ritual meals for their ancestors, even though they'd been taught by evangelists, by bishops, priests or pastors of the local churches. This is not how this works. The human spirits do not hang around waiting to be fed. They're with the Father now. They're in better shape than we are. They continued this ritual because it was so ingrained in the culture that they wouldn't stop doing it. And finally, in the 5th century, Augustine said, well, look, they're not going to stop doing this, so let's try to Christianize it. Hey, the spirits of the saints, the righteous men and women of years gone by, can intercede for us in the world today, so let's give them offerings and pray to them. And this is where the practice of venerating saints entered into Roman Catholicism and also the Orthodox churches. That can be traced to Augustine trying to redeem this practice of venerating the spirits of the dead. But all of this goes back to Shemiyaza, Saturn, Kronos, whatever you want to call him, and the rebellion on Mount Hermon, where they decided to take human wives and create this hybrid race to try to take dominion of the earth away from the children of Adam and Eve.
Hey Ohana, I hope you're loving this conversation as much as I am. I just wanted to pause for a quick moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying what you're hearing and feel like we've earned it, we'd be so grateful if you could leave us a rating or review. Your honest feedback really helps us grow and reach more people who love exploring these fascinating topics. And if you think this episode would resonate with someone you know, don't forget to share it with them. Mahalo nui loa for being part of our journey. Now, back to the show. That's crazy. All of that. That's like the Day of the Dead that the Hispanic or the Mexicans, they practice.
Exactly. And yeah, and to this day, there are places on Earth from Africa to East Asia where people still venerate the ancestors. And if you don't, you can be in big trouble. There are stories. There was a story last year of a girl who was beaten in Vietnam because her family had converted to Christianity and had stopped giving offerings to the ancestral dead. And so the village was like, the ancestors will be angry with us. And so, yeah, it got violent. So
Wow.
This still happens all over the world, and here in the United States too. I mean, look, it's one thing to leave flowers on at the cemetery for your father, your mother, your grandparents, whatever. That's just decorating the gravesite. That's not sitting down and inviting them to a ritual meal because you believe that their spirits will intercede for you in life and give you special revelation. It's not venerating them. There's nothing wrong with that. But leaving them offerings on a little altar in your home, this is a practice that goes back to Mount Hermon.
Wow. You know, the Japanese do that too. My mom's side is from Japan, and they do the same thing. They have that little altar in their home where they have their photos of their dead, and they will light up the incense and give them water, beer, and whatever food all the time. Yeah. I guess it goes back all the way, like you said.
No, it continues to this day. In Madagascar, they take the corpses of the ancestors and take them out of the tombs that they built for them every few years and rewrap the bodies and dance with them. We've talked with a Lutheran pastor who has been there. In fact, wrote his doctoral dissertation on that experience on demonic possession and exorcism, a book called I Am Not Afraid. Reverend Dr. Robert Bennett is the author, and he said this is their lives. They believe that unless they appease the ancestors by building them, the tombs, in the crypts in which the ancestors are kept are nicer than the people of Madagascar. You know, they've got homes of stone for the dead while they're living in mud huts, and it's because of fear. They're afraid that the spirits of the ancestors will be angry. And demonic possession is so common there that they've got that the Christians there have trained lay people in spiritual warfare and deliverance ministry because it is so often required. And he got there, he saw this happening right in front of him the first day he was there. A woman manifested, and he thought they were playing a joke on the American until he realized, wait, they didn't have time to set this up. What's going on? Because he saw a team of lay people casting out the demon of a woman who was on the ground frothing at the mouth and screaming. And he said, yeah, this happens a lot. This is why we are trained to do this. So suddenly his dissertation topic changed on how the idea of demonic possession and deliverance or exorcism is scriptural. And again, this all goes back to the spirits of the demons, the spirits rather of the dead, the giants who died in the flood of Noah. This was the common understanding of the early church. Again, we wrote about this in the book Veneration, and again, it comes up in the second coming of Saturn because this is how this entity and his rebellion still affects the world to this day, or one of the ways. I don't think any of us who are serious Christians would argue that demons are not a problem in the world today. There are people who do things that are just so inexplicably evil and so illogical that they must be spiritual. Now, whether it's demonic oppression, influence, or possession, that's a matter for people who are more trained in this than I am. But There's nothing in the Bible that says that the demonic activity of Jesus' day, and this is a central focus of his ministry. There's nothing in the Bible that suggests that demons just stopped at the end of the apostolic era. But the early church understood where they came from. In fact, even the pagan Greeks understood this. The poet Hesiod, who wrote a lot of what we know about Greek religion back in the classical era, he was roughly contemporary with the prophet Isaiah, 7th century BC. He wrote that the spirits of the men who lived during the golden age when Kronos ruled in heaven, and the term that he used for, and this is really fascinating, a scholar by the name of Amar Anus wrote this in a paper in 1999. So this is still really new in the terms of Christian doctrine. He wrote a paper titled, "Were There Greek Rephaim?" He was looking at a phrase that was used by the poets Hesiod and Homer, who wrote the Iliad about the Trojan War and the Odyssey. The term used for the demigods, the heroes of the Golden Age, and that's what hero originally meant. It was a demigod, a Nephilim. Not a quarterback who can throw for 400 yards. This was a hybrid, divine-human hybrid, a hero. That's what that meant to the ancient Greeks and Romans. The term for those beings, according to Homer and Hesiod, moropes anthropoi. Okay, anthropoi, it's where, we get the word anthropology, the study of humanity, okay? Moropes derives from the same Semitic root word as Rephaim. And Hesiod wrote that when the men of that generation died, their spirits became daemons. And they traveled the earth helping humanity, and they were kindly and saving from harm, etc., etc. The Greeks had a very different view of daemons than Jews and Christians. That is, in fact, where the word demon comes from. Hesiod nailed it. When the demigods, the hybrids, the Nephilim of that generation died, their spirits became demons. And the early church fathers who wrote about the giants and the origin of demons, this was the consensus until the time of Augustine. Augustine is the one who popularized the idea that Genesis 6 didn't really mean angels slept with women. It meant that the sons of Seth, who were good guys, cohabited with the daughters of Cain, who were all evil. They were bad girls. And that's what created these. They weren't really giants. They were just evil rulers. It makes no logical sense, but it also ignores what the words in Hebrew actually mean. The term translated sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, always, always, always refers to spirit beings, never to humans. So this is why we're even interested in this as a topic, Sharon and me, because we can look at the world today and say, yeah, demonic influence, it's there. The Roman Catholic Church, for all of its doctrinal issues, at least recognizes this and is trying to train exorcists. Now, their rituals for casting out demons, our friend, deliverance minister, the late Russ Dizdar, said, demons don't care if you read poetry to them. Okay, it's not about the ritual. It's about calling on the power of Jesus Christ to cast them out. But the fact is, demons exist. They're here. They were caused by this rebellion in the ancient world, led by this entity, Shemiyaza, who was known throughout history as Kumarbi, Enlil, El, Dagon, Molech, Saturn, Kronos, Baal, Haman, etc., etc., etc. And this struggle against these spirits continues to this day.
That is crazy. I never knew about hero. That's something I learned new today. That's crazy. You mentioned about powerful people believing that the stars being aligned to bring them back to the old god Saturn. How do these astrological beliefs influence our political leaders today?
Yeah. It sounds crazy, and as I want to say up front, just so people are clear on this, that we as Christians know that our fates are not determined by the movement of the planets in the sky. But there are wealthy, powerful people who do think that. In fact, Ronald Reagan, who is considered by many conservatives to be one of the greatest presidents of the last century, if not in American history, his daily calendar was set by his wife, Nancy, in consultation with her astrologer, Jean Dixon. And our friend, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis, is the son of Gene Dixon's personal secretary, so he can attest, yes, this really is a thing. This is what happened. Ronald Reagan would make his appointments based on the alignment of the stars and the planets and so on. So it shouldn't shock us to realize that there are others who really understand that, yeah, this is how we ought to do things. Well, on December 21st of 2020, there was a very interesting astronomical alignment, the great conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn. Interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, this happens about every 20 years, but it was the closest observable conjunction of the two planets, the closest the two of them had gotten together since the year 1226. Also, it occurred on the winter solstice, which is a date that is significant in the pagan calendar. It fell right in the middle of the ancient cycle of Saturnalia, the Roman festival in honor of the old god Saturn, who once ruled over a golden age, which is why the Romans kept the gold in their national treasury in the temple of Saturn. But astrologers call this one a great mutation. See, as the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn move across the zodiac, across the constellations, they move into different signs. There are 4 different types of signs: air, wind, earth, and water. And even though Aquarius is the water bearer, it is an earth sign. But whenever there is a great conjunction that finally moves out of one type of sign fully into another type of sign, I think we're moving from air into earth, if I remember right. I'd have to look it up again. That is called a great mutation, in addition to being a great conjunction. So here on December 21st of 2020, which the corporate media was calling the Christmas star, this is what the wise men saw. Well, no, it wasn't. It was kind of neat. I mean, here in the Ozarks, we get really dark skies at night. It was kind of cool seeing those 2 bright points of light close together. Not enough to get me on a camel for 3 months, like the Magi, but the great mutation in astrology occurs every 200 years and signals massive changes in human civilization, rises and the rise and fall of empires. Say 200 years ago, you go back to the 1840s, which I think was the last great mutation. We had the Industrial Revolution really taking hold and the rise of the United States as a world power. So here they're looking at this conjunction in 2020, signaling a similar sort of civilizational shift. The United States perhaps about to fall from its position or decline from its position as the world's global superpower. You know, the 20th century was the century of America. The 21st century, the Chinese are trying to make it the century of China. They still want payback for what happened to them between the 1840s and about 1945, what they call the century of shame in China. They're looking for a world that is, they say, more decentralized, which is ironic because they're trying to centralize power in their own hands. The World Economic Forum, I would argue, not coincidentally, a month after the Great Mutation, announced their plans for the Great Reset. And again, I think this is part and parcel of the of what these wealthy and occult adepts, wealthy, powerful people and occult adepts especially, see signified in what happened on December 21st of 2020. And even more interesting is that when Jupiter and Saturn met, they met at 0 degrees of the constellation Aquarius, meaning that 50 years after the Fifth Dimension sang that famous song, we are now finally fully into the age of Aquarius, which is ruled by the planet Saturn. In other words, this is sort of symbolizing a return to the Golden Age. Jupiter is handing the baton of power back to old dad, who's now back and ready to herald a new Golden Age. And the World Economic Forum, UNESCO, the Bilderberg Group, the United Nations, they think they're going to help shepherd this in by fundamentally transforming civilization, which basically means less power for us, less freedom for us, more power and more money for them. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. You'll just rent it from the people who do own stuff.
Wow, that's incredible. Wow, I didn't know all that connection there. You also pointed out occult symbols embedded in United States Capitol that I guess, the hint of the return of Saturn's reign. Can you describe some of these symbols and historical reigns or origins? Sorry.
Yeah. This really started with Tom Horn's book, Apollyon Rising 2012, and then Zenith 2016. He kind of recapitulated some of this in his most recent, one of his recent books, Zeitgeist 2025. But in that book, Sharon pointed out something that took place just after the Great Conjunction of December 21st of 2020. And we'll get to that in a minute. Tom had shown in his books that the United States Capitol encapsulates some really striking pagan imagery. The National Mall, you've got the world's tallest obelisk, the Washington Monument, much taller than anything that came out of Egypt. But it symbolizes in Egyptian religion the male member of Osiris, who, according to the myth, had been deceived by his brother Set, cut into 14 pieces. His wife Isis was able to reconstruct 13, but was missing the 14th piece, and so she fashioned one out of magic and stone or whatever, and impregnated herself to give birth to the falcon-headed god Horus. Tom argued that the United States Capitol with the dome symbolized the womb of Isis, and the National Mall being the member, the generative member, let's put it that way, of Isis, and that the United States Capitol would be used to then engender the Antichrist and bring him forth. In looking at what is inside the United States Capitol, and Tom has written about this as well, the painting on the underside of the Capitol dome, the apotheosis of Washington, there's some very interesting imagery in that painting, a fresco that was painted by a Greek artist by the name of Constantino Brumidi in 1865. So this was 70 years after the U.S. Capitol was built, which, by the way, is named the Capitol because, and this was at Thomas Jefferson's insistence, he demanded that it be named the Capitol, capital O-L, not capital A-L. Washington, D.C. is the capital A-L of the United States. Congress meets in the Capitol O-L because that's the name of the temple of Jupiter in Rome, the Capitolium. In 1799, when Jefferson was arguing with the architect about this, there was not a single building on planet Earth where a legislative body met in a building called a Capitol, except for the state of Virginia at Williamsburg. And again, it's because Jefferson wanted to evoke this image of the Roman Republic. So he insisted that Congress, the architect, Pierre Charles L'Enfant, wanted to call it Congress House. And Jefferson insisted, no, we're going to call it the Capitol. All right, so it's named for the Temple of Jupiter. Why is that relevant? Well, I suggest it's because the storm god, Zeus, Jupiter, Baal, in Matthew 12, beginning of verse 22, in Revelation 2, verse 13, Jesus identified the storm god of the pagans as Satan. I'm not saying Thomas Jefferson was a Satanist. He probably had no idea of that connection. He just wanted to evoke the image of the Roman Republic. But if we as Christians acknowledge the influence of the unseen realm, principalities, powers, rulers, of cosmic darkness, then we've got to wonder if maybe something was whispering in Jefferson's ear, and this is a grand old joke. The design of the Capitol included in its lower level, I mean, most of us are familiar with the rotunda. That's where visitors will come in. You look up, you see the painting, the apotheosis of Washington. Down in the lower level, which is called the crypt, and there's no bodies down there, but there was supposed to be. George Washington was supposed to be kept in a chamber off of the crypt, and there was a hole in the floor of the rotunda so that visitors could look down and see Washington lying in state forever in this room below the rotunda, and then look up and see the oculus, which is the Latin word that means eye, in the dome above. Now, again, that painting was not there until 1865, long after Washington's death. The dome was inspired by a building in Rome called the Pantheon. The Temple of Jupiter in Rome actually looks like the Supreme Court building Looks like what Jupiter's temple looked like. Most of our government buildings, federal government buildings anyway, look like pagan temples, and that's by design. The dome, though, comes from a building in Rome built during the reign of Caesar Augustus by a friend of his named Marcus Agrippa. And the dome, amazingly, it's a concrete dome built 2,000 years ago without rebar in the concrete, and it still stands. The Romans were good engineers. The oculus in the Pantheon, so named because it honored all the gods of Rome, the oculus, the eye, opens to the sky. Now, they've got it covered with plexiglass or something now so it doesn't rain into the building like it used to. But the point of the oculus was to symbolize the portal through which the apotheosized, in other words, the Caesar who had become a god, would join the gods in heaven. Marcus Agrippa wanted his good friend and patron, Caesar Augustus, to be honored in this way. Now, Octavian, Caesar Augustus, was a smart politician and knew the Romans wouldn't be too keen on that idea. Who does this guy think he is? We're not even supposed to have kings, and now he's saying he's a god. So Augustus said, no, we're not doing that. Now, look, if you want to say my uncle Julius was a god and put a statue of him in there, that's fine. So they put a statue of Julius Caesar in there, said, okay, he was apotheosized, he became a god, and there's the portal that led him up into heaven. Now, in the U.S. Capitol, the dome does not open under the sky, but there is an oculus there, and in 1865, Bermidi put this painting up there showing George Washington becoming a god, up there with pagan gods like Minerva and Hephaestus or Vulcan, and Ceres, the grain goddess, is up there. It is, I think, something that George Washington, regardless of what you think about his actual religion, probably would have found horrific. He would not have agreed to it. His body is not in the Capitol because before they could move his body from Mount Vernon, which was his property there in Virginia, because Martha had agreed to it, Martha Washington. But then the War of 1812 came and the Brits burned the Capitol. And so after the war, there were your typical construction delays whenever you get government involved in a project. So by the time they got the building rebuilt and expanded because Congress was bigger, because the United States had grown, George's descendants said, no, we're not going to do that. So they covered up the hole. The hole is no longer in the floor of the rotunda, and the crypt is empty. But they did put this painting there. So when you're looking up towards the sky through the portal, you see George Washington surrounded by these pagan deities. Now, I argued that I think Tom Horn was on the right track, but rather than the Antichrist being engendered there in the Capitol, I think what this symbolizes is the return of old Saturn to herald a new golden age, according to a poem written by the Roman poet Virgil in the year 40 BC. He was another one who benefited from the generosity of Caesar Augustus. He wrote a poem called the Fourth Eclogue, which was for another political figure in Rome back in the day. But he wrote this, now the last age by Cumae's Sibyl sung, the Cumaean Sibyl, very important in Roman history, and the majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. Justice returns old Saturn's reign, with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. And then he goes on in this poem to say how you, O Gaius Asinius Pollio, again trying to flatter the politicians, with your new administration, we'll have a new golden age brought in by Saturn. I think that's what's represented on the inside of the Capitol dome. Washington is shown seated with his legs wrapped in purple cloth, purple being the symbol of royalty. And in the temple of Saturn in ancient Rome, the statue of Saturn had his legs wrapped in wool for 51 weeks out of the year, except during Saturnalia in December, when his legs were unwrapped, which symbolized Saturn's return to the world of the surface before he was sent back down to Tartarus. I think that the symbols involved in the United States Capitol, and there's some other things too, like the Great Seal of the United States and some of the Freemasonry, some of the teachings of Freemasonry, also are related to this. But I think the bottom line is this. What we see in the United States Capitol, in that painting especially, but even in the art and the architecture of the building itself, a sort of a prophecy in stone, if you will, of the return of this entity who once ruled over the world as Shemiyaza, who has been known since then by many names, including Saturn, Kronos, Molech, and who thinks somehow that when he gets out, he is going to resume his place or take his rightful place in the heavens as the ruler of creation. I think, and I argue in the book, The Second Coming of Saturn, that the polemic in Isaiah chapter 14, "Oh, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning," refers to this entity, Saturn, not Satan. Shemiyaza, not Satan. The entity who is considered so dangerous by God that he is locked up in Tartarus, the bottomless pit, while Satan is still roaming the earth. That is what I think is inside the United States Capitol. And the events of January 6th, 2021, not an insurrection, but actually a demonstration, I think, a symbol of what this entity thinks. Remember how the politicians, the political class in D.C. described the riot at the Capitol on the 6th of January. They've desecrated our temple of democracy. Over and over again, we heard that phrase. They've desecrated America's temple of democracy. Liz Cheney, former representative from Wyoming, actually said the most sacred space in our republic. Like, wait, excuse me? It's just an office building. The most sacred space in our republic is wherever you are when you are praying. This was repeated again and again by multiple politicians, and I think that's how they view it. A sacred space. Well, sacred to who? Based on the legislation they're passing, they're certainly not sacred to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is, and the fact that the rebellion, so-called, was led by the buffalo hat guy. In the book and in previous books, we've gone into how common bison or bull imagery is among the pagan gods of the ancient world. In fact, even the name Kronos, even though he's a Greek god, because of the influence of the Semitic world, the Canaanites, the Amorites, and the Hebrews on Greek religion, the name Kronos actually derives from a Semitic word that means horns. So I think there are a lot of connections here, and the takeaway for me, though, as a Christian, is that God has seen all of this from the beginning of time, and none of us should be panicked or afraid. It just helps to understand what is going on in the world around us, and then to step back and say, yeah, okay, Psalm 2, why do the nations rage and imagine a vain thing? He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord holds them in derision. So don't panic.
Well, I know you're pressed for time, and I thank you so much. It's been absolutely enlightening discussing these profound topics with you today. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible insights and for your significant work that you explore, and your wife, connecting these ancient texts and modern beliefs. We really appreciate it. I really appreciate you. And thank you very much for coming.
Gracious. No, it's been my honor. You're very gracious, and I am blessed to be equally yoked with a person, my best friend, who sees this as fascinating, as exciting as I do. And I know I get kind of long-winded in these answers. Sitting on the other side of the microphone as I do, I know that guests with short answers are a lot easier sometimes. So I appreciate letting me roll on here. But I get so excited when I see what's in the Word of God and how these puzzle pieces fit together. These things made no sense to me when I was in church as a kid, 10, 12 years old. Why is this here? You're just telling me you got to have faith. You got to believe. But this doesn't make any sense. But the information is there when you start digging into the original Hebrew, the Greek, the Aramaic, start looking at loan words, and then what do the pagans around the ancient Israelites believe? Oh, wow. The prophets knew what their neighbors believed. Shock. And a lot of what they wrote was in response to that. God has seen all of this. He delivered this information to us, and it's all there. And if we're getting anything right, well, then credit to him for preserving all of this. And God bless the scholars who dig into this and help us to see what's in the text. I don't read Hebrew. I don't speak Hebrew, but we read the work of people who do. And so credit to the epigraphers, to the translators, to the archaeologists. That's not my calling. Sharon and me, man, when the new heaven and the new earth get here, we want jobs in the library. Lord, please, jobs in the archives. And we'll do our best to, until then, to try to share the excitement that we find in these texts with the world, because we as Christians, it's like our friend L.A. Marzulli says, it describes the Bible. This is the guidebook to the supernatural. It's all in here. We just need to do a little digging.
Yeah. So where can our guests find you?
The easiest way is to go to gilberthouse.org, gilberthouse.org, and from there you'll find links to our social media sites. You can find the link to our app. That is really getting a lot of use, and we're very grateful for that. Not just because it delivers content, but there's also a messaging section that's connecting people who are interested in these things and who are lifting one another up and praying for one another and sharing needs with one another. So that is really a blessing. But it's all available at gilberthouse.org.
And that brings us to an end of another episode. I want to thank my special guest, Derek Gilbert, for such a powerful and thought-provoking conversation. If this was your first time hearing him, I highly recommend you diving deeper into his work. And to my incredible supporters, Stephanie, Jen, Carla, David Zai, Andrew, Kevin. Thank you again for buying me a coffee and supporting me on Patreon. You guys make this podcast possible, and it helps keep me speaking the truth, even when platforms try to silence it. So if you haven't already yet, please make sure you sign up for my free Patreon so we don't lose touch. YouTube isn't guaranteed, and I've already had content removed. So in case one day this all disappears, I want to make sure we can still stay connected. So thank you to everyone who listens, who watches, who shares, and comments. I may not get to reply to each and every one of your messages, especially the weird, crazy ones, but I see you. Thank you for your support. It means everything. And remember, the ancient scriptures hold keys to future revelations. So until the next time, guys, keep watching the signs and keep questioning everything. Mahalo nui loa. Bye.
Hop in my getaway car, let's go just for the night. Nowhere is ever too far, baby, all we got is time. A small town, run down, so let's run away from here. From the ghost to the coast, where everything is clear. Follow me from the past into the future. We don't need any bags or any pastors. Let's be in the present, I don't wanna sweat it, I just wanna start all over. Just wanna start all over. All over. We don't need the memories, just need to wipe the slate clean. Go from chaos to the peace, I need to focus on me. A small town, run down, so let's run away from here. From the ghost to the coast, where everything is clear. Follow me from the past into the future. We don't need any bags or any pastors. Let's be in the present, I don't wanna sweat it, I just wanna start all over. Just wanna start all over. All over. Follow me from the past into the future. We don't need any bags or any pastors. Let's be in the present, I don't wanna sweat it, I just wanna start all over. Just wanna start all over.